There are moments in history when a nation must pause, look inward, and ask, not what is easy, but what is right. Tonight, I invite you to walk with me on a journey that is not just about trade, or tariffs, or politics. It is about identity, purpose, and the soul of a people. This is the story of choices forged in challenge, of sovereignty guarded with resolve, and of faith in a destiny only we can shape. Stay with me, for by the end, you will not just understand the decision. We will feel it together, deep in heart and spirit. Over the past few years, the trade relationship between India and the United States began to fray under the weight of increasingly aggressive tariff policies. Initially, the U.S. government introduced a 25% import duty on a range of Indian goods, everything from textiles and steel products to certain agricultural items. This sudden hike disrupted pricing structures and eroded the competitiveness of Indian exports in the American market. The rationale given by the U.S. was framed around protecting domestic industries and ensuring fair trade, but for Indian exporters, it translated into an immediate financial burden. Products that once entered the U.S. at competitive rates now faced a cost barrier that few buyers were willing to absorb. Importers in the U.S. began shifting toward alternative suppliers from countries unaffected by the new tariffs, cutting into India's market share almost overnight. The situation worsened when the U.S. escalated the tariff rate to 50% on several key Indian export categories. This was not a symbolic move, it directly targeted sectors that formed the backbone of India's trade revenue with America, such as gems and jewelry, textiles, and certain processed foods. For small and medium-sized enterprises in India that relied heavily on U.S. orders, the impact was immediate and severe. Margins shrank, production slowed, and in some cases, businesses shut down operations altogether. Beyond the numbers, these escalating tariffs signaled a deeper shift in trade relations. The increases were not isolated adjustments but part of a broader, more confrontational approach by the U.S., positioning India less as a strategic partner and more as a competitor in critical economic areas. This strained the trust that had underpinned bilateral trade for decades and set the stage for retaliatory measures and eventual disengagement in formal trade agreements. India has long maintained a tariff regime that ranks among the highest in the world, especially compared to other major economies. The country's average most favored nation MFN tariff rate hovers around 17%, but in certain sectors, particularly agriculture, it can climb to nearly 39%. These high duties are designed to protect domestic producers from being undercut by cheaper imports, a policy deeply rooted in India's developmental and economic history. Agricultural goods such as dairy products, edible oils, and certain grains face steep import taxes, making it costly for foreign exporters to compete in the Indian market. Similarly, manufactured goods like automobiles, electronics, and certain luxury items also encounter high tariff walls. These measures help shield local industries from global price fluctuations and foreign dominance, but at the same time, create friction with trade partners seeking wider market access. In addition to tariffs, India employs a range of non-tariff barriers that further complicate entry for foreign goods. These include licensing requirements, product-specific quality standards, and lengthy customs procedures. For instance, imported food products must meet strict safety and labeling regulations that often differ from international norms. The same applies to pharmaceuticals, electronics, and telecom equipment, where certification processes can be slow and costly for foreign companies. These barriers are not solely about economics. They reflect India's broader goals of self-reliance and national security. By controlling what comes into the country and under what standards, India can protect critical industries, maintain employment levels, and ensure consumer safety. However, from the perspective of trading partners like the United States, these policies appear restrictive and sometimes discriminatory. They argue that such measures tilt the playing field in favor of domestic producers, making it harder to establish a balanced and mutually beneficial trade relationship. India's economic strategy in recent years has increasingly centered on building internal strength through initiatives like Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. These programs aim to boost domestic manufacturing, reduce dependency on imports, and develop homegrown capabilities in key sectors such as defense, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. The focus is not merely on replacing foreign goods with Indian alternatives, but also on creating an ecosystem where local industries can thrive, innovate, and compete on a global scale. Make in India encourages both domestic and foreign companies to manufacture within India's borders by offering incentives, improving infrastructure, and streamlining certain regulatory processes. It targets industries ranging from automotive and textiles to information technology and heavy engineering. The goal is to turn India into a manufacturing hub capable of supplying both domestic and export markets. Atmanirbhar Bharat, introduced in 2020, goes a step further by emphasizing self-reliance in a broader sense. It promotes local sourcing, indigenous research and development, and the use of domestic supply chains wherever possible. This policy came into sharper focus during global disruptions, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, when international trade routes and supply availability were severely affected. While these initiatives are positioned as development strategies, they inevitably influence trade dynamics. Encouraging local production often means discouraging imports in sectors where domestic alternatives are viable. This can be achieved through tariffs, import licensing, or preferential treatment for Indian suppliers in government procurement. For trading partners accustomed to a more open Indian market, these measures can appear as protectionist moves. By strengthening its industrial base, India aims to ensure economic resilience, create jobs, and maintain strategic independence in critical areas like defense technology and energy security. This inward focus changes the balance of trade relationships, especially with countries heavily invested in exporting to India. Beyond customs duties, India's trade environment includes a wide range of non-tariff measures that can significantly slow or limit the entry of foreign goods and services. These are not direct taxes, but regulatory, procedural, and administrative requirements that influence how easily imports can enter the Indian market. One major category is licensing requirements. Certain goods, such as pharmaceuticals, agricultural products, telecom equipment, and chemicals, require special import licenses, which can be time-consuming and bureaucratic to obtain. This adds uncertainty for foreign exporters who must plan shipments months in advance while navigating complex application processes. Quality control regulations also play a central role. India has its own set of product standards, often developed through the Bureau of Indian Standards (BIS), which may differ from globally accepted norms. Goods like electronics, toys, and packaged foods must pass specific testing and certification procedures in India, even if they already meet strict safety standards elsewhere. These requirements can delay market entry and increase costs for exporters. Digital and data-related rules present another layer of complexity. India's data localization policies, for instance, require certain categories of data to be stored on local servers. This affects foreign companies providing digital services, cloud computing, or e-commerce, creating operational and compliance challenges. Sudden regulatory changes also contribute to trade friction. New rules can be introduced with limited notice, leaving businesses scrambling to adapt supply chains and documentation. This unpredictability increases perceived risk for foreign exporters and investors. While such measures are often justified as safeguards for consumer safety, environmental protection, or national security, they can have the effect of limiting competition from abroad. For trading partners like the United States, these non-tariff obstacles are viewed as significant market entry barriers, even in sectors where formal tariffs might already be low. India's foreign policy has long emphasized the principle of strategic autonomy, the ability to make independent decisions in matters of national interest without being bound to any single global power. This approach is especially visible in India's continued economic and defense engagement with Russia, even as geopolitical tensions between Russia and Western nations have intensified. Russia remains a key supplier of defense equipment to India, providing advanced fighter jets, missile systems, submarines, and other critical military hardware. These defense ties are the result of decades of cooperation with shared technology transfer agreements and co-development projects that have shaped India's military capabilities. Severing or drastically reducing these links would require costly replacements and disrupt existing defense readiness. Energy is another vital area of collaboration. In recent years, India has increased its imports of Russian crude oil, coal, and fertilizers, often at discounted rates. This has helped stabilize domestic fuel prices and maintain supply security, particularly during periods of global market volatility. Such arrangements are seen in New Delhi as pragmatic economic decisions rather than political endorsements. However, these continued dealings have drawn criticism from the United States, which views sustained trade with Russia as undermining its sanctions regime and strategic objectives. Washington has signaled that closer India-Russia ties complicate deeper trade and strategic cooperation with the U.S., particularly in sensitive sectors like defense technology sharing. India's position is that maintaining diversified partnerships, whether with the U.S., Russia, or other nations, is essential to safeguarding its sovereignty. It resists aligning exclusively with any geopolitical bloc, arguing that a balanced approach allows it to respond flexibly to shifting global power dynamics. This insistence on autonomy, while central to India's identity in foreign policy, has become a sticking point in negotiations with the United States over the broader economic and trade relationship. Trade talks between India and the United States have been held repeatedly over the past few years, with both sides attempting to resolve disputes over tariffs, market access, and regulatory barriers. Despite the shared recognition of the economic benefits of cooperation, these negotiations often ended without agreement, largely due to misaligned priorities and expectations. The United States pushed for substantial tariff reductions on agricultural products, industrial goods, and certain manufactured items, aiming to increase its market share in India. It also sought the removal of non-tariff barriers, such as complex licensing requirements and product-specific standards, which it considered discriminatory against U.S. exporters. In exchange, Washington offered to restore trade privileges under frameworks like the Generalized System of Preferences (GSP), which had previously allowed many Indian goods to enter the U.S. duty-free. India, however, approached the discussions with its own set of demands. It sought greater access for its IT services, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and agricultural products in the U.S. market. Additionally, it pushed for fewer restrictions on skilled worker visas, which are vital for Indian technology companies operating in America. Several sticking points proved difficult to overcome. For example, the U.S. was unwilling to significantly loosen its stance on visa rules, while India was reluctant to lower tariffs on sensitive sectors such as dairy and agriculture, citing the need to protect small farmers. There were also disagreements over digital trade rules, particularly regarding India's data localization policies. At times, communication gaps and political considerations on both sides slowed progress. Domestic pressures in each country, ranging from protecting local jobs to appeasing key voter groups, meant that compromise was politically risky. Even when partial agreements seemed possible, they often fell apart in the final stages, leaving the relationship strained and unresolved. India's trade relationship with the United States is deeply tied to a few key industries, making these sectors highly vulnerable to policy changes, tariffs, and market disruptions. Among the most affected are textiles and apparel, gems and jewelry, pharmaceuticals, and electronics, industries that collectively employ millions and contribute significantly to export earnings. Textiles and apparel have historically enjoyed strong demand in the U.S., but higher American tariffs have sharply reduced their competitiveness. Small and medium-sized enterprises, which form the backbone of this industry, often lack the resources to absorb the added costs or shift to alternative markets quickly. This has led to reduced orders, factory slowdowns, and job losses in certain manufacturing hubs. The gems and jewelry sector, particularly polished diamonds, faces similar risks. The U.S. is one of the largest buyers of Indian jewelry, and sudden tariff increases directly hit exporters' margins. For an industry heavily dependent on skilled labor and global demand cycles, even a minor disruption in the U.S. market can have a cascading effect on employment and income stability. Pharmaceuticals, another major export category, have been challenged not only by tariffs but also by heightened U.S. regulatory scrutiny. India is a leading supplier of generic medicines to the American market, and any tightening of import standards or inspection requirements can create costly delays and compliance challenges. Electronics and engineering goods are also exposed to U.S. market shifts. Many Indian manufacturers produce components for American tech firms, meaning trade barriers can disrupt integrated supply chains. Because these sectors are so reliant on U.S. demand, any policy change from Washington, whether tariff hikes, new regulations, or procurement restrictions, has an outsized impact. This concentration of trade in a few industries amplifies the economic shock when bilateral relations encounter turbulence. India's overall economy has demonstrated notable resilience in the face of U.S. tariff hikes and trade restrictions. With a large domestic market, diversified trading partners, and robust GDP growth driven by sectors such as services, infrastructure, and domestic consumption, the country has managed to avoid a nationwide economic crisis. Macroeconomic indicators, including foreign exchange reserves and overall growth rates, have remained relatively stable, reassuring investors that the broader economy can absorb external shocks. However, this stability at the national level contrasts sharply with the hardships experienced in specific regions and industries that are heavily dependent on U.S. trade. For instance, manufacturing clusters that produce textiles, leather goods, or gems for the American market have seen sharp declines in orders. Small and medium-sized enterprises in these sectors often lack access to alternative export destinations, making them especially vulnerable to sudden shifts in demand. Job losses and wage cuts have been particularly acute in export-oriented towns and cities. Workers in these areas face limited opportunities for quick reemployment because their skills are often tied to specialized production lines geared toward U.S. buyers. Reduced income in these communities not only affects households directly, but also impacts local businesses, from food vendors to transport operators, creating a ripple effect through local economies. Some industries, such as pharmaceuticals and electronics, have managed to cushion the blow by expanding sales to other markets. Yet, the process of diversification takes time, and during the transition, smaller suppliers still suffer disruptions in cash flow and capacity utilization. This divide between a macroeconomy that appears healthy and local economies that struggle illustrates the uneven impact of trade tensions. National figures can mask the real pain felt in regions where livelihoods are tied to industries most exposed to U.S. market fluctuations. In response to escalating trade tensions with the United States, India has accelerated efforts to diversify its trading relationships and reduce dependence on a single dominant partner. This strategic pivot involves strengthening existing ties and forging new agreements with a wide array of economies, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, ASEAN nations, and members of the BRICS group. Negotiations with the European Union have aimed at reducing tariffs and improving market access for Indian goods such as textiles, pharmaceuticals, and IT services, while offering European exporters better access to India's large consumer base. Similarly, the India-UK trade talks have focused on lowering barriers in sectors like automobiles, food products, and professional services. These agreements are seen as steps toward creating a network of diversified markets that can absorb shocks from disruptions in any single trade corridor. India has also deepened economic engagement with ASEAN countries, seeking to tap into growing consumer demand in Southeast Asia and to participate more actively in regional supply chains. This includes collaborations in electronics manufacturing, renewable energy, and agri-based industries. Within BRICS, India has pushed for greater trade in local currencies, reduced dependency on the US dollar, and expanded cooperation in sectors such as energy and infrastructure. Partnerships with nations like Brazil, South Africa, and Russia are also part of this approach, allowing India to access raw materials, technology, and new export destinations. These shifts are complemented by policies promoting domestic substitution for imports that have become less viable due to tariffs or supply constraints. By building stronger ties with multiple partners and expanding its export base, India aims to reduce vulnerability to unilateral trade measures from any single country and create a more balanced, multi-directional trade network that supports long-term economic stability. The escalation of tariffs and trade tensions between India and the United States has had noticeable effects on financial markets and the value of the Indian rupee. Currency traders closely monitor geopolitical developments, and the imposition of higher U.S. duties on Indian exports has contributed to volatility in the foreign exchange market. The rupee has faced downward pressure as investors reassess India's export earnings potential and anticipate possible capital outflows. A weaker rupee can make Indian exports more competitive globally, but it also raises the cost of imports, particularly for essential commodities like crude oil, machinery, and electronics. Since India is a major importer of energy, any depreciation in its currency increases the import bill, potentially adding to inflationary pressures. This creates a policy challenge for the Reserve Bank of India, which must balance the need to stabilize the currency with the goal of maintaining economic growth. Stock markets have also reacted to the trade rift. Export-dependent companies, especially in sectors such as textiles, pharmaceuticals, and gems, have seen share prices fluctuate sharply in response to tariff announcements and stalled negotiations. Foreign institutional investors, who play a significant role in Indian equity markets, often adjust their portfolios based on perceived trade risks, leading to shifts in capital flows. Bond markets are not immune either. Concerns about inflation and fiscal pressures can lead to rising yields, making government borrowing more expensive. This can have knock-on effects for infrastructure spending and economic stimulus measures. Overall, while India's financial system remains stable, the uncertainty surrounding trade relations with the United States has introduced additional layers of risk into currency and market dynamics. These conditions require careful policy management to prevent short-term shocks from undermining broader economic stability. India's decision to end trade with America was not born from haste or hostility, but from a long series of pressures, tariffs that cut deep, barriers that limited fairness, and policy differences that could not be bridged. Each factor tested the balance between opportunity and sovereignty until the path forward demanded independence. This choice reflects a larger truth. A nation's economic destiny must be shaped by its own hand. Good luck to all who strive for fair, open, and balanced trade. Thank you for listening, for questioning, and for believing in the power of informed decisions. The future is ours to shape.